thought what we would do this morning is just start with a little bit of a quiz. Okay? It's a multiple choice quiz. And some of you...
Everyone has to be involved, you see.
I know Mike likes quizzes.
Some of you might know the answers to some of these, and some of them don't necessarily have a definitively right or wrong answer. But the first question is, where was Jesus born? Don't say Bethlehem, because I'm not talking about... In what kind of structure does the Bible say Jesus was born in? Any offers?
It says a stable. I know you're not going to say that.
All right, okay. A stable, a house, or a cave?
I know the answer to that one, because I've run it before.
Okay, all right.
House.
Okay, the second question, actually I need to get my notes up because otherwise
You won't know what you're
I'll
saying.
sort of get a bit lost. There we go. Second question, when was Jesus born? Was he born in the middle of the night? Was he born during the day? Or don't we know?
We don't know.
We don't know. No.
We know the shepherds came in the night.
If you listen to all the Christmas carols, you would kind of get the impression he was born in the middle of the night.
That's because the shepherds in the night, wasn't it?
We still don't know. You're quite right. Third question. How long do you think had Mary and Joseph been in Bethlehem when Jesus was born? Had they been there just, for, say, several days or perhaps even 2 or 3 weeks?
I'd say several
Or
days.
a few hours?
Several days, I would say.
Several days? Good,
Because
okay.
they were hunting round for somewhere to stay, weren't they?
Well, maybe.
I mean,
Maybe.
Maybe.
Some people have been around us long enough to know the tricks.
everything.
All right, okay. And
World as you guys.
what animals do you think were there? What animals do you think were there when Jesus was born? We've got, the ox and ass, which we sang about earlier on this morning, didn't we? Or sheep, or none.
Could have been any.
I'd say ox and ass.
Okay, all right, good. And then the last question, what time of year was Jesus born?
Well, that's in dispute.
Spring, summer, autumn or winter?
Winter.
You reckon winter? Okay.
When's the carols winter?
Yeah.
No, winter.
Listen.
Nissan, yeah. Right, okay. Well,
How do you know this, though, mate?
some of these things we might be looking at this morning. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work.
Oh, you found it on YouTube, did you?
Oh, no, here we go. It does help if I turn the clicker on.
Yeah.
Right, so what I want to do this morning is just spend a few moments reflecting on how the Christmas story, first of all, is usually told, okay? So let's just picture the scene, okay? So Bethlehem town lies still, illuminated by moonlight, peacefully sleeping and completely unaware that the Son of God has been born in one of its ramshackled old buildings. Through the kindness of the innkeeper, a young couple have been offered shelter, and only just in time. There, in an anonymous back street, hidden from sight, is a drafty old stable. But inside, warm and cosy from the heat of the animals, despite the winter cold, a family sits quietly, lit by a warm glow. And around them, a donkey, a cow, and an ass lie serene, gazing contentedly. The cow lifts its head and breathes a gentle moo at the child, at which the child lying in the feeding trough stirs. Kneeling beside the baby, Mary and Joseph remain in silent adoration of the child. The piece is interrupted by the arrival of a bunch of smelly shepherds, followed shortly afterwards by 3 wise men with some noisy camels. Finally, after they've all gone, all is calm, all is not quite right. We've seen it, haven't we? We've heard it, we've seen it portrayed and depicted in countless nativity plays and movies and Christmas messages, and we've sung it 1,000 times in traditional, well-loved Christmas carols, haven't we? But sadly, the reality of what the Bible actually says is in many ways quite different, and it shatters the Christmas card scenes and cuts out actually quite a few characters from the traditional nativity play. You see, the fact is, according to the Bible, Jesus wasn't actually born in a stable. And the Bible doesn't even hint that that was the case. What we've come to accept as the Christmas story actually demonstrates just how much we read the scriptures through the lens of our own assumptions and our culture and our traditions. Shows us how often we read the biblical text without reference to actually what it's saying in the context of the culture of the day. And so we end up missing or at worst misinterpreting what it's really saying. But at the same time, it also highlights the power of tradition and how resistant tradition is to change. You know, the more they're perpetuated, the more difficult they are to overcome. Now, don't get me wrong, because I love Christmas and I love the Christmas story, but the reality is a little bit different to the traditional version. And the consequence is that some of the conclusions that we draw from it might also need to change. And I think one of the main differences is the belief that Jesus was lonely and rejected, cast out amongst the animals and sidelined at his birth. And that loses sight of the way in which Jesus in his birth is actually a disruptive force, bursting in the midst of normal everyday life and then explosively offering the possibility of its transformation. So, where did it all go wrong? How? Yes.
No, actually, it's medieval. It's the medieval. It's the
It goes back a long way, actually.
Mama's place.
Yeah. How did we end up with the traditional version of events that's at odds with the biblical narrative? I think there are three causes, and they all sort of conspire to veil the true picture of what we see in the scriptures. First of all, there's traditional elaboration. Secondly, there are issues of grammar and meaning. And thirdly, there's a big unfamiliarity with the first century Jewish culture. So let's look at the stable issue first, all right? There are two factors here that have conspired together to point us towards a stable as Jesus' birthplace. First of all, Luke tells us in two places that the baby was laid in a manger. He says Mary wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger. And the shepherds were told that they would find the baby lying in a manger. Now, we all know that a manger is a kind of feeding trough for animals, which you would expect to find in a stable. But there's more. You see, the second factor to add to this is a verse that's found in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2. And that says, "The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib, but Israel does not know, and my people do not understand." Now, this is where the tradition of an ox and an ass accompanying Jesus' birth comes from. By interpreting this verse with a messianic understanding, coupled with Luke's reference to a manger, it led medieval illustrators to depict an ox and an ass recognizing the baby Jesus. You see, domestic animals and a feeding trough, well, where else would you expect to find them but in a stable? Well, we'll come to that in a few moments. All right? Now, the second problem concerns the inn, and I think in many ways it's the heart of the matter. You see, traditionally, most Bibles tell us that Mary wrapped Jesus in swaddling clothes and laid him in the manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Now, unfortunately, this is a very bad translation of the Greek word that Luke uses. And the word in question is kataluma. And it's a word that's used to describe something rather different to an inn. It's the word that would be used to describe a spare or upper room in a house.
It's a guest house, a guest room.
Yeah, a guest room or something like that. A private lodging place where no payment was expected. And it's the same word that actually Luke again uses for the upper room in which Jesus and the disciples shared the Last Supper. It was just a large upper room attached to a house. Now, an inn, on the other hand, is a completely different Greek word, pandikaion. And this refers to a place used for the shelter of strangers, and normally it would have had something like a common dormitory and a refectory, somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat.
Can I
You know?
just, am I allowed button because I know you're
Yeah.
recording, but I'm very unusual in first century
Yes,
Israel anyway.
yes,
I mean,
yeah.
an inn is a medieval thing from
Yeah.
our culture. An inn was the travelling place that we had, and so when those mummers were putting together their plays in their culture, an inn made more sense. That would be where they would stay. The thought that every family probably had a guest room in their house that they kept for when family came to stay, which is what that word more likely means, wouldn't have been in their mindset.
Yeah. Yeah, the inns of the day were a little bit different to what we understand as an inn, because mostly when people travelled in those days, they travelled in a thing called a caravan. Now, a caravan to us is a box on wheels, but a caravan in those days was a whole company of people travelling together for safety. And so when they arrived at their destination and they needed somewhere to stay, all they would get will be a large building with a dormitory, in other words, somewhere to kip, and somewhere to get something to eat, and that's it. And they would pay somebody, for the privilege. But what we're talking about here is something rather different. You see, the Cataluma was often built on the roof of the house, and it would have been, very limited in its facilities. It wasn't always in use, so therefore it would only have had, a very bare furnishing, just probably a bed and a chair or something like that. Luke, what he's saying here is that there was no room in the Cataluma. There was no room, or the guest room was either too small, or in many ways it was unsuitable for Mary in her current condition.
It could also have been full, because
It could
what
have
we're
been,
talking about
yeah.
is them returning to their family. They're going back
Yeah.
to their family home. They're going to Bethlehem, which is the family home. So they would have had family in Bethlehem.
Yeah.
So where would you go and stay when you came to Bethlehem? You go to your family. But other members of the family have already turned up, and they're filling that room. That's my understanding. They're already filling that room, so there's no room left in that room for them. Yeah?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Okay.
I'm trying not to take the message away from you, but
Thank you.
Sure.
Right, we're going to come back to all this in a moment, because let's just then briefly look at the third issue, and that relates to a lack of understanding of both the historical and the cultural context of the story. Because when is this taking place? It's taking place 1st century AD. At that sort of pivot point between BC and AD. In other words, a couple of thousand years ago, when culture and history was a little bit different to what it is today. Remember that in response to the requirement of the census, Joseph is returning to the sort of ancestral home of his forefathers. And so it would be unthinkable that Joseph, returning to the place of his ancestral origins, wouldn't have been received by other family members, even if they weren't close relatives. Even if he's never been there before, he can appear suddenly at the door and recite his genealogy. He's among friends. Joseph only has to say, "I'm Joseph, son of Yaakov, son of Matan, son of Eleazar, son of Eliud." And the immediate response must have been, "You're welcome. What can we do for you?" So having arrived in Bethlehem and been welcomed in, what kind of house would they have stayed in? Well, a typical home at that time was quite simple, and it was pretty universal. We're used to all kinds of different shapes and sizes of homes, but in those days, there was plan A and there was plan A and a bit, They all looked pretty similar. And they consisted of a single large room that was used both for eating and for sleeping, and pretty much everything else. You know. Normally at one end there will be a lower section with steps going down. So if you imagine it's all on one level, but then at one end there's a lower section and steps go down into that. And that is where animals would have been kept. So the animals would have been brought in at night. Why do they bring animals in at night? Well, actually in those days there was a lot of theft. Yeah, wild animals, attacking them, but also, they were safer actually indoors at night than they were out, in the fields and things. So the animals would have been brought in at night, and they also would have provided a certain amount of warmth in the home. They weren't kept in an outbuilding. They had a shared space in the home. That's the point. So there was no inn and there was no stable. So while we're at it, let's lay another tradition down, shall we? That is that Mary gave birth almost as soon as they arrived in Bethlehem. All right, the same night even, according to some traditions. But again, that's not actually what the Bible says. What Luke says is while they were there, the time came for Mary to give birth. All right. Now, he doesn't give us a time span, but the implication there is that, it wasn't as soon as they arrived. Otherwise, I think he might have said something a little bit different. During the time they were staying there, and we don't know how long that was, but it did get extended, probably beyond what they were expecting it to be. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem would actually have taken several days. Direct route was 70 miles. But unfortunately, the direct route went through Jericho, which was not the safest route. All right. So they often had to go back over the Jordan, take a detour around Jericho and extend the journey by, probably another 20 or 30 miles. And the safest way to travel in those days, as I said, was in a community, the caravan, and a whole group of people would have made the journey together. So Mary and Joseph would have made this journey sometime in advance of Mary's expected confinement. They wouldn't have done the journey if she was, likely to drop the baby partway through the journey or something like that. Yeah. So they would be well settled into this house, this home, before the time came for her to give birth. And then the only mention of night time is that was when the shepherds were watching over their flocks. So the angelic visitation to the shepherds might well have taken place at night, but they wouldn't have tried to find their way from the Judean hills into Bethlehem in the dark, would they?
Well, didn't they have the star to guide them?
No, they didn't. They only had the angelic visitation. It was the Magi that had the star. The shepherds were on their own after the angels had departed. They got the angels, the Magi got the star. Yeah.
The angels singing.
So, they probably wouldn't have made that journey in the dark, after the angels had gone. They would have waited till the first light and then made their way down into Bethlehem.
That makes sense.
But when they got there, how would they know where to go? How would they know which house to look in? Because there were, the population of Bethlehem could have been anything up to, 400 or 500, something like that, lots of houses. How would they know where they would find this baby? Well, they'd ask in the first house where a baby had recently been born, and in a tight-knit community like that, that kind of news would travel fast, and they would easily have been directed to the right place. So let's just press the pause button for a moment and consider the implication of all this. All right, what difference does it make whether Jesus was born in a stable or in a home?
None at all.
I think it actually does make a little bit of difference.
Why?
I'm just about to tell you. You see, the traditional version of the Christmas story is very powerful, and it appeals strongly to the emotions of sentimentality, doesn't it? But it does so at the cost of first of all, its Jewish centrality, and it also deflects us away from one of its foundational points of impact. I think. We find it quite difficult to read the story in its own cultural terms, and instead we try and impose our own assumptions and our interpretations. You know, as I said earlier on, the question comes up, where do you keep animals? You see, if you live in the West, you keep them somewhere away from the home, you know, in a stable or in a barn. But not so in the Middle East in the first century. You know, the animals were very much part and parcel of everyday life, in and out of the home, or the lower part of the home at least, you know, every day.
Well, so they were here.
Probably were at the same time. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah. Stables and barns and things like that are much more recent things. But it's also easy to underestimate how powerful a hold a tradition can have over our reading of Scripture. You know, because the more we hear, the more it becomes ingrained in our thinking and our memory, and the more entrenched it is in the way that we interpret the story. Traditions are very powerful things. You know, they can give us a shared sense of participation and community, can't they? And they're able to connect us with the past through memories of days gone by. And they reassure us that some things don't change, a sense of certainty in an uncertain world. So some traditions are good. So to question our traditions and suggest that the reality of the Christmas story was something rather different is actually to pull the rug out from under many familiar Christmas carols, you know, in a lowly cattle shed, a drafty stable with an open door, in the bleak midwinter. You know, it means that we have to reevaluate one of the fundamental elements of the message of Christmas. And the problem with the stable, I think, is that it distances Jesus from us. You've probably all heard Christmas messages where, you know, we're told that Jesus wasn't born in a palace, even though he was a king, you know, because that means he wouldn't relate to us. Being born in a palace would separate him from us, because we are not of that sort of aristocratic stock, you know, so there would be a separation there from us, all right? But I think the same would be true if Jesus had been born in a stable, because most human beings are not born in a stable, all right? It's a very odd place for a baby to be born. Where do most births take place? No. It's true that in the sanitized West, many births occur in hospital, but actually on a global scale, the vast majority of women give birth in the familiar surroundings of the home and the family. So when the time came for Mary to deliver her child, first I'm sure all the men would have been shooed out of the house and the women would just get on with what they were used to, assisting a young girl to deliver her first baby. There was nothing supernatural about the birth of Jesus, all right? All the miraculous stuff had occurred around his conception. You know, the incarnation was the miracle, but his birth was quite natural. You know, it was just another normal, routine birth in the context of a normal Jewish home. And if Jesus was born into a normal family home, he's not an unrelatable king beyond our comprehension, you know, born with all the privileges of a palace. But neither is he some otherworldly figure, you know, born into an equally unusual and quirky place like a stable. We can relate to him as a normal child born into a normal family home, just like the overwhelming majority of others born at the same time. He was born just like the rest of us. You know, he's one of us so that we can relate to him on that level. Jesus came because we were in a mess. You know, some people point to the mess of the stable, saying that Jesus was born in a place of squalor and, you know, as an outcast in order to identify with us. But in truth, the mess that Jesus was born into wasn't the mud and the straw and the animal poo and, you know, all the stuff in a stable, but the mess of a world that had been messed up by human sin. Jesus was born into the mess and the chaos of the world so that he could redeem it. Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And to be God with us, he came in the same way as us. Not hidden away out of sight in a palace or a stable, but in a home in the midst of everyday life. And that's the point, isn't it? You know, he is God with us in the context of our everyday life. Not just in the, you know, the exceptional circumstances that we sometimes find ourselves in. By being born in a family home, surrounded by the same very sinful people that he came to save, who couldn't see God face to face, who couldn't enter into the Holy of Holies to be in the presence of God. He was entering into that messy world that he came to fix, showing that God was making it possible for mankind to be in relationship with him again. The traditions that we cling to don't always serve us well, and they don't give us what we hope they would. We have more and better food than we've ever had, but we're getting less and less healthy. You know, we have more wealth than before, but we can't overcome that division between rich and poor. We've got better medicines than ever, but we still don't know how to face death. Einstein once said, the definition of foolishness is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. If we just keep doing the same old things in our nation, in our communities, in our lives, life isn't going to get any better. Something has to change. So, as we meditate on this Christmas story once again, it's good to enjoy the season. But the real wonder of Christmas isn't our traditions and our glittering lights or the food or the festivities. The wonder of Christmas is that God really is with us. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And we've seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Charles Wesley summed it up beautifully in these words: pleased as man with man to dwell, Jesus, our Emmanuel.